Evolution's final mistake. Humans became the galaxy's ultimate predator in the distant future. Humanity was far from the most powerful species in the galaxy. While other alien species had evolved with unique abilities to survive in the harshest of environments, humans had something else, an unbreakable will to survive. Unlike the alien species who had claws to tear through enemies, psychic powers to manipulate minds, or hardened skins that deflected the fiercest of blows, humans were fragile creatures. Their bodies weren't made to thrive in extreme environments, and their senses were average at best. But what humans lacked in physical strength, they more than made up for with their minds. For centuries, humanity struggled to survive among the stars. They were often outmatched, outclassed, and underestimated. But it was this very struggle that spurred humanity to develop technology and strategies to overcome their limitations. Their ships were faster, their weapons more precise, and their minds sharper than those of other species. While aliens evolved their bodies, humans focused on adapting their technology. They learned to manipulate energy, harness resources from barren planets, and terraform entire worlds to suit their needs. Slowly, they carved a place for themselves in the galaxy. The first big breakthrough came when humans discovered the ruins of an ancient alien race, one that had long been forgotten by history. Buried deep within the remnants of their civilization lay technology far more advanced than anything humanity had ever encountered. This discovery would change everything. Humanity's scientists worked tirelessly to understand the alien technology. It was a machine unlike any they had seen before. It didn't just build things, it reshaped life itself. It was a device capable of directly modifying the genetic code of any organism. This wasn't just a tool for altering crops or livestock. It was a tool for altering the very foundation of life. At first, the human governments were cautious. They knew that tampering with genetics could have disastrous consequences, but the temptation was too strong. The potential to overcome their physical limitations and create a stronger, more resilient species was too great. After much debate, the first human volunteers stepped forward. They were the brave souls willing to risk everything to see if this new technology could make them stronger, faster, and more capable of surviving the galaxy's harshest environments. The results were nothing short of astonishing. The volunteers who underwent the genetic modifications became something far more than human. Their muscles grew stronger, their senses sharper, and their minds more agile. They were no longer just survivors. They were predators, finely tuned to survive in the most brutal conditions. Their bodies could adapt to extreme temperatures, dangerous atmospheres, and toxic environments. They became the first of a new breed of humans, genetically enhanced to survive anywhere. This was just the beginning. As the modified humans began to push the boundaries of their new abilities, they realized that the genetic enhancements didn't just make them stronger, they made them smarter. These humans could adapt to any situation, think faster than any other species, and learn at a rate that was previously thought impossible. They had evolved in a way no other species in the galaxy had. Where other species had used their physical traits to dominate their environments, humans now used their minds to reshape their very biology. The leaders of the galaxy took notice of this new breed of humans. For centuries, the galaxy had been ruled by a coalition of powerful species, each with its own strengths. The warlock, a fierce species with razor-sharp claws and an aggressive nature, the Psychons, beings with psychic abilities capable of manipulating thoughts and memories, and the Shalvok, a race with impenetrable armor-like skin, were the dominant species in the galaxy. The human race had always been an afterthought, a minor player among the stars. But now the humans had found a way to level the playing field, and then some. As humans spread across the galaxy, they began to encounter these other species in ways they never had before. The warlock, once thought of as the most fearsome warriors in the galaxy, were quickly outmatched by the humans' superior strength and speed. The Psychons, capable of reading minds and manipulating thoughts, found themselves unable to control the humans, who had evolved minds even more powerful than their own. And the Shalvok, with their tough, indestructible skin, could not withstand the new weapons the humans had developed, tools that could bypass even the toughest armor. Soon, humanity had become a force to be reckoned with. No longer just survivors, humans had evolved into hunters. They had perfected their species through genetic manipulation and technological advancements, and they were now at the top of the food chain. They became known as the Deathworlders, a name that struck fear into the hearts of every other species. The Deathworlders were no longer a species to be ignored. They were a species that would conquer or destroy any obstacle in their way. But it wasn't just their physical power that made humanity so dangerous. The human mind, now sharper and more calculating than ever before, was their true weapon. While other species relied on their natural abilities to dominate, humans used their intelligence to outthink and outmaneuver their enemies. They could anticipate their foes' moves before they made them and adapt to any situation faster than anyone else. In battle, they were unstoppable. Where other species used brute force, humanity used strategy. Where others fought with their bodies, humanity fought with their minds. As humans expanded their reach, they began to change the galaxy. Entire planets were terraformed to suit their needs, transforming barren, lifeless worlds into thriving hubs of human civilization. The old powers of the galaxy, the Warlock, Psychons, and Shalvok, found themselves slowly being pushed to the edges of space. No longer the dominant species, they were forced to contend with the rising power of humanity. But despite all of their advances, humanity wasn't satisfied. The Deathworlders had only scratched the surface of their potential. With every passing year, they became stronger, faster, and more intelligent. And the most terrifying part was that they weren't stopping. As more humans underwent genetic modification, their evolution continued at an accelerating pace. It was clear that humanity was on the verge of becoming something far beyond anything the galaxy had ever seen. And as their power grew, so did their ambitions. But no one could have predicted just how far humanity would go. In their quest to perfect their species, the humans had created something that would forever change the balance of the galaxy. They had made themselves the ultimate predators, a species that would not just survive the galaxy's brutal environments, but dominate them. A species that would not stop until they were the only ones left standing. And so, humanity's journey toward becoming the galaxy's most terrifying force had only just begun. They were no longer just survivors. They were now the apex predators of the galaxy, and nothing could stand in their way. The rise of humanity as the galaxy's most powerful species did not go unnoticed. As humanity's influence spread through the stars, the other races began to take notice of the growing power of the Deathworlders. It wasn't long before the galaxy's ruling council, a coalition of the most dominant species, decided to take action. The council had ruled the galaxy for centuries, and they saw the Deathworlders as a direct threat to their control. The idea that one species could evolve faster, stronger, and smarter than any of them was an unsettling thought. At first, the council believed that humanity's rise could be stopped with diplomacy. But this approach quickly failed. When humanity's leaders began to make their demands, the council hesitated, unsure of how to deal with a species that no longer feared them. The galaxy's powers were used to bending weaker species to their will, but the Deathworlders had no interest in submitting. They weren't just fighting for survival. They were fighting for their place at the top of the galaxy's food chain. The council saw no other option but to eliminate the threat. They had failed to control humanity through words, so they decided to do so with force. The council's strategy was simple. If they couldn't outsmart the humans, they would overpower them. They gathered their greatest warriors, elite soldiers from across the galaxy, and sent them to Earth in a desperate attempt to stop the Deathworlders before they became too powerful. The first attack came from the Warlock, a brutal species known for their savage strength. They were the galaxy's greatest fighters, with muscles that could crush metal and claws sharp enough to tear through armor. The Warlock thought they could defeat humanity with their raw power. They came in droves, descending on Earth like a storm, ready to burn everything in their path. But they didn't expect the Deathworlders' resilience. The humans had evolved into warriors who not only survived the Warlock's brutal attacks, but adapted to their strength. The Deathworlders fought back with precision, using strategy and technology to outwit and outmaneuver the Warlock at every turn. Within days, the Warlock were retreating, leaving Earth scarred but standing. Humanity's first real victory against the galaxy's powers was a testament to their strength. The Deathworlders had not only survived, but thrived in the face of overwhelming force. It was a message to the galaxy. Humanity was not to be underestimated. However, the Council would not give up so easily. If the Warlock couldn't do the job, they would send in their next weapon, the Psychons. The Psychons were a race of beings with powerful psychic abilities. They could read minds, manipulate thoughts, and control emotions with a mere thought. For centuries, the Psychons had ruled through their mental prowess, bending the wills of other species to their commands. The Council believed that if they could send the Psychons to Earth, they would be able to break humanity's spirit and make them surrender. The Psychons arrived, their minds sharp and ready to strike. They sought to infiltrate humanity's thoughts, twisting their emotions and clouding their judgment. They thought they could control the humans by taking over their minds, but they had underestimated one crucial detail. The humans' minds had evolved to a point where they were immune to the Psychons' influence. The Deathworlders' minds were now too advanced to be controlled. The first confrontation was unlike anything the Psychons had ever experienced. They tried to invade the minds of the Deathworlders, but their psychic powers bounced off the humans, leaving them with a sense of confusion and frustration. The Deathworlders fought back with their intelligence, creating mental barriers that the Psychons could not break. The humans' minds were simply too strong, and the Psychons found themselves unable to defeat them with their usual methods. The Council began to realize that their plans to stop humanity were failing. Their strongest warriors, the Warlock, had been defeated by humanity's sheer adaptability and strength. Their psychic masters, the Psychons, had been unable to control the minds of the Deathworlders. The next step was clear. They would need to resort to something far more dangerous and desperate. They turned to the Shalvok. The Shalvok were a species of beings with impenetrable armor-like skin. They were a race that had evolved to withstand the harshest environments and could survive the most extreme conditions. The Shalvok had never been defeated in battle, their tough armor protecting them from any weapon. The Council believed that the Shalvok would be the key to finally defeating humanity. The Shalvok were sent to Earth with one goal: destroy the Deathworlders. But even the Shalvok were not prepared for the humans' ability to adapt. The Deathworlders had studied the Shalvok's armor and developed weapons capable of penetrating even the toughest of defenses. The humans used their technology to create specialized armor-piercing rounds that tore through the Shalvok's seemingly invincible defenses. The battle between the Deathworlders and the Shalvok was brutal, but it was clear that humanity's evolution had reached a point where they could face even the strongest of opponents. The Shalvok, once thought to be unbeatable, were no match for the humans' speed, intelligence, and adaptability. Slowly but surely, the Shalvok forces were defeated, and the Deathworlders stood victorious once again. The Council was left in shock. Their most powerful warriors, the Warlock, the Psychons, and the Shalvok, had all failed to defeat humanity. With each defeat, it became more and more apparent that humanity was not just a species to be feared. They were a species to be reckoned with. As the dust settled, the leaders of the galaxy's most powerful species gathered in secret. The death of their elite warriors had sent shockwaves through the galaxy, and the Council could no longer ignore the threat humanity posed. They realized that the Deathworlders were not just a problem that could be dealt with through force. Humanity was evolving too fast, too unpredictably, and their power was growing exponentially. The leaders of the Council began to whisper in hushed tones about the possibility of an alliance. Some suggested they could unite against humanity, but others feared that the Deathworlders had already become too powerful. Humanity was no longer just a threat. They had become the galaxy's ultimate predators, and no one knew how to stop them. Meanwhile, humanity's leaders were not unaware of the growing tension in the galaxy. They knew that the Council would not stop until they were destroyed, and they knew that they had to act quickly to secure their place at the top. The Deathworlders had evolved beyond the need for diplomacy or negotiation. They had become predators, and they were ready to claim their place as the true rulers of the galaxy. The humans had come to a decision. If the galaxy's other species were not willing to coexist with them, then they would rule it. And no one, no matter how powerful or ancient, would stand in their way. The Deathworlders had become the apex predators of the galaxy, and they would not be stopped. As humanity's power grew, so did the tensions across the galaxy. The Deathworlders had quickly become the galaxy's most feared species, their strength, intelligence, and adaptability setting them apart from every other race. However, as the Deathworlders rose, they discovered that their greatest strength also came with a challenge. How far could they push their evolution before it consumed them? For now, though, they didn't have time to worry about the future. The galaxy's leaders were still reeling from their defeats at the hands of humanity. The Council knew they could no longer fight the Deathworlders through traditional methods. They had tried brute force, psychic manipulation, and even armor-piercing weapons. Nothing had worked. The Deathworlders were unstoppable. The galaxy's ruling council turned to a new plan, one that involved a much darker path. They decided to call on a forgotten race, one that had once been the galaxy's most terrifying predators, the Nihilans. The Nihilans were an ancient race that had once ruled over countless worlds with their unparalleled abilities to hunt and kill. They were masters of stealth, able to move through the shadows without a sound, and they possessed senses so keen that they could track their prey across entire planets. Their technology was ancient but powerful, designed for one purpose: to hunt and to kill. The Council knew that if they wanted to stop humanity, they needed the Nihilans. They were the only species that could stand a chance against the Deathworlders. But summoning the Nihilans came at a cost. The Nihilans didn't simply fight for the highest bidder. They fought for power, for survival, and for control. They were mercenaries, and their price was steep. The Council had no choice but to agree to their terms, knowing that if the Nihilans succeeded, humanity's reign would come to an end. The Nihilans' first move was a direct assault on one of humanity's most advanced colonies. The colony, located on a planet surrounded by hostile environments, was one of humanity's greatest achievements. It had been built using the Deathworlders' advanced technology and was considered nearly impenetrable. But the Nihilans had no fear. They moved in the shadows, striking without warning, using their speed and stealth to infiltrate the colony. The Deathworlders, still recovering from their previous battles, were caught off guard. The Nihilans attacked with ruthless precision, sabotaging systems, destroying communications, and taking down key defense structures. The Deathworlders fought back, but their enemies were ghosts. The Nihilans moved in and out of the shadows, slipping past the humans' defenses and disappearing before they could be caught. Humanity's leaders quickly realized that they had underestimated their new foes. The Nihilans were not like the Warlock, the Psychons, or the Shalvok. They were a different breed entirely. They didn't rely on brute strength or psychic powers. They didn't need armor or weapons. They were pure predators existing only to hunt and kill. And now they were hunting humanity. The Deathworlders knew they had to adapt quickly if they were going to survive. They could no longer rely on their raw strength or advanced technology alone. They needed to become more than just survivors. They needed to evolve further, to push their genetic enhancements to new heights, if they were going to stand a chance against the Nihilans. As the Deathworlders scrambled to respond to the Nihilan threat, they began to experiment with new genetic modifications, ones that would enhance their stealth, their senses, and their ability to hunt like the Nihilans. They developed new techniques to enhance their vision, allowing them to see in the dark and track the faintest of movements. They strengthened their bodies, making them faster and more agile, able to move as quickly and silently as their enemies. But even with these new modifications, the Deathworlders found themselves constantly one step behind the Nihilans. Every time they thought they had gained an advantage, the Nihilans adapted and found new ways to exploit the humans' weaknesses. The battle for survival had become a deadly game of cat and mouse, with neither side willing to give up. It became clear that the Deathworlders would need more than just new enhancements. They would need to change their entire approach to war. The Deathworlders' greatest strength had always been their ability to think and adapt quickly. But now they had to learn how to think like the Nihilans, to become predators in the truest sense of the word. Humanity's top leaders, scientists, and military strategists came together to form a new plan. They would train their warriors to become hunters, using the very tactics that the Nihilans had perfected over thousands of years. They would embrace their primal instincts, learning how to stalk their enemies, how to strike without warning, and how to vanish before anyone could even see them. The first test came when the Deathworlders launched a counterattack on the Nihilans. This time, the Deathworlders didn't rely on brute force or advanced technology. They moved in the shadows, using stealth and surprise to their advantage. They stalked the Nihilans, learning their movements and anticipating their next move. The Deathworlders didn't just fight back. They hunted, just as the Nihilans had done. It was a brutal battle, fought in the dark corners of the galaxy where no one could hear the screams of those who fell. But for the first time, the Deathworlders began to gain the upper hand. They had learned how to think like their enemies, how to become predators in their own right. And in the end, it was the Nihilans who found themselves outmatched. But the Deathworlders' victory came at a cost. While they had become the hunters, they had also become something else, something that went beyond just survival and strength. They had become the very thing they had feared, predators without mercy, creatures that hunted for the sake of hunting. The lines between predator and prey had blurred, and humanity now faced a new question. How far could they push their evolution before they lost their humanity? As the Deathworlders continued to adapt and evolve, they began to wonder if they had made a mistake. They had gained the ability to survive anything, but at what cost? The Nihilans had been defeated, but now humanity was left to face the question of what it meant to be truly human. Was the galaxy's ultimate predator still human, or had they become something else entirely? Despite these questions, the Deathworlders pressed on, determined to secure their place at the top of the food chain. They knew they couldn't stop their evolution now, not after everything they had fought for. The galaxy had changed, and humanity had become its apex predator. But as they looked to the future, they couldn't help but wonder, what would happen when they became too strong? When there was no one left to challenge them, the Deathworlders had become the apex predators of the galaxy, but with that power came a growing realization. They had no true enemies left. For centuries, the galaxy's greatest species had fought for dominance, but now humanity stood at the top, unmatched and unrivaled. The Warlock, the Psychons, the Shalvok, and even the Nihilans, all of them had fallen to the humans' relentless rise. And yet, despite all of their victories, the Deathworlders began to question whether they had truly won. The galaxy had changed, but so had humanity. They had evolved beyond the point of mere survival. The Deathworlders were no longer just warriors. They were rulers, sitting at the top of the food chain with no challengers in sight. However, in the silence that followed their victory, a new fear began to take root within them. What would happen when there was no one left to fight? What was the point of being the greatest predator if there was no prey left to hunt? Humanity's leaders, once unified by a singular goal, to survive and evolve, began to disagree on what came next. Some believed that their evolution had reached its peak. They had become the perfect predators, and now they needed to move beyond mere conquest. Others, however, felt that the galaxy still needed to be controlled. There were too many untamed worlds, too many species that could pose a threat if allowed to grow unchecked. To them, the goal was clear. Humanity must continue to expand and conquer, ruling over every corner of the galaxy to maintain their place as the ultimate predator. As the debate raged on among the Deathworlders, a new threat emerged from an unexpected source: the Ancient Ones. The Ancient Ones were a race so old that their origins were almost forgotten. They were beings of immense power, not physical strength, but of ancient wisdom and knowledge. For millennia, they had watched from the shadows as civilizations rose and fell. They had never interfered in galactic affairs, but now they felt it was time to act. The Ancient Ones had seen the Deathworlders rise and their unrelenting thirst for power. They understood that humanity had reached a tipping point, one where their evolution could no longer be contained. The Ancient Ones had knowledge that no other species possessed, the secrets of the universe, the keys to unlocking the full potential of life and death itself. And they had decided that humanity must be stopped before they became too powerful, before they disrupted the natural order of the galaxy. The Ancient Ones did not attack directly. Instead, they began to manipulate the very fabric of the galaxy, sowing discord among humanity's leaders and spreading doubt throughout the ranks of the Deathworlders. They planted whispers of a terrible truth: that evolution, no matter how perfect, could not be sustained forever. That humanity's rise would ultimately lead to their downfall. That no species, no matter how powerful, could ever truly escape the cycle of life and death. As the Deathworlders struggled with these dark revelations, a new kind of war began. It wasn't fought with weapons or genetic modifications. It was a war of the mind. The Ancient Ones had infiltrated humanity's most advanced minds, planting seeds of doubt and fear. They targeted the Deathworlders' greatest strength, their unyielding will to evolve. The more they pushed humanity to evolve, the more they risked losing their humanity altogether. In the midst of this mental conflict, a lone figure emerged. She was a Deathworlder who had seen the dangers of their evolution firsthand. Once a warrior, she had fought in some of the most brutal battles ever fought, but now she had begun to question everything. She had come to realize that humanity's greatest strength, their evolution, was also their greatest weakness. The more they changed, the more they lost sight of what it meant to be human. Her name was Lyra, and she was one of the few who had begun to see the true cost of humanity's rise. She had once believed that becoming the ultimate predator was the key to securing humanity's future, but now she saw it as a path to self-destruction. Lyra had witnessed firsthand how the Deathworlders had grown stronger, faster, and more intelligent, but at what cost? The more they evolved, the more they began to lose their connection to the very things that made them human: compassion, empathy, and a sense of morality. Lyra had become a voice of reason among the Deathworlders, a figure who spoke out against the relentless drive for power. But her message was not well received. The Deathworlders were not accustomed to questioning their own nature. They had been trained to evolve, to conquer, and to survive at any cost. And now there were those among them who saw Lyra's doubts as a weakness, a betrayal of everything they had fought for. But Lyra was undeterred. She knew that humanity's future depended on their ability to adapt in a different way, not just physically, but morally and spiritually. She believed that the Deathworlders needed to evolve in a new direction, one that would allow them to retain their humanity while still maintaining their power. But convincing the others was a battle that would take everything she had. Lyra knew she couldn't do it alone. She began to gather a group of like-minded Deathworlders, those who had also begun to question the path they were on. Together, they worked to counter the influence of the Ancient Ones, using their own advanced knowledge and understanding of evolution to push back against the seeds of fear and doubt that had been planted in their minds. The conflict between the Deathworlders and the Ancient Ones was not one of physical strength, but of ideals. The Ancient Ones sought to control the galaxy's future by keeping humanity in check, while Lyra and her group of rebels believed that true power lay not in dominating others, but in finding balance. They didn't want to destroy the Deathworlders' evolution. They wanted to guide it, to ensure that humanity could grow without losing what made them human in the first place. As Lyra's rebellion grew, so did the tension between the Deathworlders and the rest of the galaxy. The Ancient Ones' influence continued to spread, manipulating the minds of key leaders and weakening humanity's resolve. But Lyra and her followers pushed forward, determined to show the galaxy that humanity didn't need to destroy everything to survive. They didn't need to become the ultimate predator. They just needed to find their true place in the universe. The war between the Deathworlders and the Ancient Ones reached a boiling point when Lyra discovered the ultimate truth. The Ancient Ones had been manipulating the galaxy for millennia, ensuring that no species ever became too powerful. They had seen the rise of countless civilizations, and each time they had made sure that no one species could dominate the galaxy for long. Lyra realized that the true battle was not just for humanity's future, it was for the future of all species. The galaxy's balance had been carefully maintained by the Ancient Ones, but that balance was now being threatened by humanity's unchecked rise. Lyra knew that the only way to secure humanity's future was to confront the Ancient Ones and end their manipulation of the galaxy once and for all. But even as she prepared for the final confrontation, Lyra understood that humanity could never go back to the way things were. The Deathworlders had changed the galaxy, and no matter the outcome, they would never be the same again. They had become predators, yes, but they had also become something more, a force capable of shaping the future for better or for worse. The fate of the galaxy hung in the balance, and it was up to Lyra and her followers to decide which path humanity would take. Would they continue down the path of endless conquest, or would they find a new way to evolve, one that balanced power with compassion, strength with understanding? The choice was theirs, and the galaxy would watch as humanity made its final decision. The galaxy was on the brink of transformation, and humanity stood at the center of it all. For years, the Deathworlders had been unstoppable. They had conquered enemies, adapted to every challenge, and evolved into the most powerful species the galaxy had ever seen. But now, their victory had come at a price. The question no one had dared to ask before had become impossible to ignore. What came next? Lyra and her group of rebels had come to realize that humanity's future wasn't just about conquering the galaxy, it was about shaping it. The Deathworlders had risen to power, but they had also become something different, something far more complex. In their relentless drive to become the ultimate predators, they had lost touch with what made them human. They had become more than warriors. They had become a symbol of the galaxy's changing nature. Lyra had spent years fighting for a future where humanity's power could be balanced with compassion. She believed that the Deathworlders didn't need to destroy or dominate. They needed to find their place in the galaxy, to be a force for progress without losing their humanity. But her beliefs were not shared by everyone. There were still those within the ranks of the Deathworlders who saw the galaxy's submission as their rightful destiny. They believed that strength alone defined their future, and any weakness was something to be eradicated. But the Ancient Ones had been pulling the strings from the shadows, and Lyra knew that humanity could not afford to be controlled by such an ancient force. The Ancient Ones had seen the rise of countless species, each one destroyed or humbled before they could become too powerful. The galaxy's balance had been carefully maintained by these beings, but Lyra had come to believe that this balance was no longer necessary. Humanity had evolved beyond their control. The galaxy's future was not something to be dictated by ancient forces. It was something to be shaped by the beings who inhabited it. The final confrontation between the Deathworlders and the Ancient Ones was set to take place on a barren planet at the edge of the galaxy. The planet had no name, no history, no value, except for the fact that it was the perfect place for the final battle. The Deathworlders had gathered their forces, ready to face the Ancient Ones and their influence. Lyra knew that this fight wasn't just about defeating an enemy. It was about proving that humanity could lead the galaxy into a new era, one where strength and compassion could coexist. As the battle began, it was clear that the Ancient Ones had not come to fight in the traditional sense. They didn't need to use physical strength or advanced weaponry. Their power lay in their ability to manipulate minds, to control the thoughts and actions of others. The Deathworlders' minds were strong, but they had never faced anything like the Ancient Ones. The battlefield became a war of wills, a struggle for control of the very thoughts that defined their reality. For Lyra and her followers, the battle was not just a fight for survival. It was a test of humanity's ability to evolve beyond the cycle of violence and dominance that had defined so much of their history. The Ancient Ones had maintained the balance of the galaxy for so long, but Lyra believed that it was time for humanity to chart its own course. They had to prove that they could lead not through domination, but through understanding. As the battle raged on, the Deathworlders began to fight back in ways that the Ancient Ones hadn't anticipated. They adapted, not just in physical strength, but in mental resilience. The Deathworlders' ability to evolve quickly became their greatest asset. They didn't just resist the Ancient Ones' manipulations, they learned from them. They began to see beyond the immediate threat, recognizing the long-term consequences of their actions. They began to understand that strength was not just about power. It was about the ability to make choices, to choose what kind of species they wanted to be. Lyra's voice became a rallying cry for her people. She led her followers with the conviction that humanity's future didn't lie in the hands of the Ancient Ones or in the power of a single species. It lay in the ability of all species to coexist, to work together for the betterment of the galaxy. It was time for humanity to take control of its own destiny, not as predators, but as stewards of the galaxy. As the Ancient Ones realized that their influence was slipping, they began to fight harder, using their ancient knowledge to manipulate the fabric of reality itself. But humanity had changed. The Deathworlders, now united under Lyra's leadership, fought back with everything they had, using their evolved minds, their advanced technology, and their newfound understanding of their place in the universe. In the end, it wasn't the power of their weapons that won the battle, it was the power of their minds. The Deathworlders had learned how to think not just as warriors, but as leaders. They had come to understand that true power wasn't about domination, it was about evolution in every sense of the word. They had evolved beyond their desire for control. They had learned to adapt in ways that no one had thought possible. The Ancient Ones, realizing that they could not defeat this new humanity, finally withdrew, their influence fading as the Deathworlders' resolve strengthened. Humanity had proven that they were no longer just a species of survival. They were a species capable of shaping the future of the galaxy. The galaxy had entered a new era. The Deathworlders, once seen as mere predators, were now leaders. They had learned the value of cooperation, the importance of understanding, and the necessity of balance. Lyra's vision had become a reality. Humanity could be powerful, but they didn't have to be ruthless. They could lead without losing their humanity. The galaxy, once filled with constant conflict and shifting powers, had found a new stability. It wasn't perfect, but it was better. The Deathworlders had learned that true strength wasn't about conquering others. It was about working together, understanding one another, and finding common ground. And so, humanity's place in the galaxy was secured, not as the ultimate predator, but as a force for good. The galaxy had witnessed their rise, and now it would witness their evolution into something greater. A new chapter had begun, one that promised a future where strength and compassion could coexist. Lyra stood on the planet's surface, watching as the stars stretched across the sky. The battle was over, but the journey was just beginning. Humanity had proven that they could evolve, that they could become something more than the sum of their parts. And now it was time to see where this new path would lead. The galaxy was theirs to shape, and humanity was ready to lead it into the future.